We mentioned yesterday that most people, think of the March on Washington like the only person that showed up was Martin Luther King Jr., which obviously wasn't true. The person that was actually the most visible at the March on Washington was A. Philip Randolph. I mentioned yesterday, he was an elderly civil rights leader. He was 75 years old at the time of the march. He had actually tried to organize a similar march in Washington, D.C. in 1941 in support of a different civil rights bill that didn't get taken care of. And this new March on Washington was going to be modeled after his earlier march, so he was very involved and very prideful. The idea is at the conclusion of the march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, several people were chosen to speak, including Randolph himself, and I read yesterday that he basically stated at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that, we are not a mob, we are the advance guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom, making sure that it did not have a violent or negative connotation to it. And I did mention yesterday that one member of the civil rights movement scheduled to speak was a guy named John Lewis. At the time, he was a very young, more radical civil rights advocate. He would later become a very distinguished member of the House of Representatives from the state of Georgia. However, on this day, Lewis's intentions were to state in a speech that he could not support Kennedy's bill. Now, I told you the reason why is because he believed that President Kennedy's efforts concerning the civil rights movement were too little, too late. Well, there were a lot of people that were concerned about this. There were civil rights leaders there were church leaders there, and especially the White House was very concerned if he gave a negative connotation at this speech. And one particular individual, the Catholic Archbishop in Washington, D.C., Patrick O'Boyle, basically stated, I will not give the invocation for this march when it gets to the Lincoln Memorial if this young man doesn't tone down his comments. If he comes out negative against this, I am not going to give the invocation, threaten not to give the invocation. And several people talked to Lewis about toning down his remarks, and he refused, saying that I want to speak my mind on civil rights. So as we mentioned yesterday in a preface, who actually sat down with him privately and talked to him about it? A. Philip Randolph. And he basically stated to Lewis, quote, I wanted all my life for this opportunity. Please don't ruin it. I wanted all my life for this opportunity. Please don't ruin it. Stating that, hey, this is something that's been important to me my entire life. I got passed over in 1941. Don't ruin this for me. Well, Lewis agreed, and he altered his speech to a more positive tone, and everything went fine on his behalf. Now, this is really interesting, I think. One of the most powerful speeches given that day, other than Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, was given by a fellow by the name of Walter Reuther. He's on your ID sheet. Walter Reuther. He gave probably the most powerful speech in my mind, other than the famous I Have a Dream speech. Now, here's the thing that makes it so interesting. He was an American labor union leader. What does that mean? Alexa, do you know what a labor union leader is? We had one in this building. We had a labor union leader that was a teacher in this building last year. It's changed to somebody else. Who represents the WEA, the Wyoming Education Association, for the high school? Anybody know who that is? Right. Last year was Mrs. Pike. Okay, this year it's Mrs. Overcast. But this guy was a union leader for the nation. He was a national labor union leader. And what a labor union is there's different types of unions. You have the Teamsters Union that works with transportation. When I was a young kid and worked in Colstrip between the time I graduated from high school and went to college, I was a laborer at Bechtold, which was a big coal company in Colstrip. And I had to join the laborers union to get in there. You have the pipe fitters union, and you have the iron workers union. But what it is, it's a union you join and pay dues to. I'm a member of the Wyoming Education Association, which is a labor union that if somebody tries to treat me poorly, I can have the labor union kind of support me and be my representation. Well, this guy was the main representative for the United Automobile Worker Union. These are the people that build all the cars in Detroit, Michigan, Ford, Chevy, GMC, Pontiac, whatever. This guy is the head of the labor union, or the United Automobile Workers Union, which was a major, major powerful union in the United States. This union, everybody that worked in Detroit was a member of and paid dues to. The thing that was so remarkable that this guy came out and spoke for civil rights and for President Kennedy's legislation, other than the fact that he was a major American labor union leader who supported the United Automobile Workers Union, he was white, which was really unusual. And I think that the words he said, in my opinion, might have equaled up to the words that Martin Luther King Jr. said to a point. Now, listen to his words. You don't have to write them down, but listen to what he says here. Think about this. This is a white person standing in front of this group speaking on behalf of civil rights and Kennedy's legislation. He says, quote, "I am for civil rights because I believe that freedom is an indivisible value, that no one can be free unto himself. And when Bull Connor and his police dogs and fire hoses destroy freedom in Birmingham, he's destroying my freedom in Detroit, where all the cars are made," right? Now this is what he said, and tell me what you think he's getting to here. To me this was just profound. He said, "We cannot defend freedom in Berlin so long as we deny freedom in Birmingham." Think about that quote. We cannot defend freedom in Berlin so long as we deny freedom in Birmingham. Who's he taking a shot at when he says that? President Kennedy. Very good, Lily. You can defend at all costs the freedoms of the people that live in Berlin, West Berlin, but you cannot do that in your own country in Birmingham. He took a shot at the president, but is that a remarkable quote? We cannot defend freedom in Berlin so long as we deny freedom in Birmingham. Great. I think that was one of the best points of the whole day. Now, again, this final quote was a direct shot at President Kennedy. What's President Kennedy doing during this time? He is back in the White House watching. He doesn't want to put himself in the spotlight of the march. And you can write down whatever you want here, but you should kind of know this. The one speech that caught the nation's attention and became the most historically significant, obviously, was the one given by Martin Luther King Jr. Who introduced him to speak? Who introduced him? A. Philip Randolph. Very good. And of course we know that King's speech will be long remembered in American history as the "I Have a Dream" speech. Now I'm just going to read some things from it. You don't have to write them down. Then I'm going to give you a really interesting scenario I think you'll enjoy. Here are some excerpts from that famous speech. He said, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He said, he does a great rendition, "Let freedom ring from the mountaintops of Rockies of Colorado." He goes back and forth, and then he says this, "When we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." And then he ends the speech, right? We all know that, do we? Here's my question to you. Did you know that that speech, he had notes to speak 4 minutes? He spoke 16. 12 minutes of his speech were totally ad-libbed. Totally ad-libbed. And I'll get a chance to show you this. We won't have time today because you kiddos have got to go to your thing. But we'll show you part of it tomorrow, or we'll show you the speech. How many people have seen the speech in its entirety, start to finish? Not a lot of kids have. I'm going to show you the whole thing in its entirety, and I'm going to want you to kind of say to me, I think that's where he started ad-libbing. 16 minutes long, He had text for 4 minutes. He ad-libbed the last 16. Now, the Kennedy administration was very pleased at the events of the Civil Rights March on Washington. Historians believe that the effects of that march did influence votes through Congress that eventually led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 during the Johnson administration. Now, my question to you, kiddos, where is that speech? Anybody know where the speech is? Well, I'll tell you. See, Dr. King's historic speech ended up in the hands of a young man by the name of George Raveling. That's all I really want you to write down. The speech ended up in the hands of a young man by the name of George Raveling. Now, I'm going to tell you the story. I just want you to listen to it, and I'm going to show you a video where he tells you. It is incredible. It gives me goosebumps. It's an incredible story. So George Raveling had kind of some unusual circumstances that led him to having final possession of this famous speech. He was just 26 years old. He was a native of Washington, D.C., and he was a former basketball player at Villanova University. And he was a last-minute volunteer for the March on Washington, and he was assigned a pretty coveted spot during the march near the podium to Dr. King's left when he gave his speech, just to provide some sort of protection, basically, is what it was for. Well, immediately after Dr. King concluded his I Have a Dream speech, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, he starts to fold the speech up, and as a rabbi is congratulating Dr. King on his speech, George Raveling asks him if he can have it, and he hands the speech to him, hands it to him, okay? Well, we told you to remember this, and I think some of you do. He ended up just tucking the speech in his copy of Harry Truman's memoir, Year of Decisions. He just sticks it in there, and he leaves it there for 20 years. Doesn't pull it out of there for 20 years. Well, in 1984, he's the head men's basketball coach at the University of Iowa, which was a little bit unusual to have a black head coach at that time in '84. Well, he was doing an interview. And because he was black, the interviewer asked him if he ever had anything to do or was ever involved in the civil rights movement. And he tells him the story. He says, well, kind of. And he tells him this story that he has the speech. And the guy goes, you got the speech? You got the original speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave on the March on Washington? Yeah. Well, after the interview, he said, well, I better maybe find that thing. And so he began to look for the speech, and he found it right where he left it 20 years earlier in that autobiography of Harry Truman. Well, since its discovery, the speech has been framed, and he's had it the last 30 years in a bank vault. And not that anything I have compares to that, but one of the things when you have signatures like this is the reason I blocked the window and had the stuff put on it, is because sun will make those go away. And so he has framed this thing and has spent the last 30 years in a bank vault. Well, he is 83 years old now, and he considers himself the guardian of the speech. And a few years ago, he was interviewed by CBS News, which you're going to see here today, about that historic speech. And he said to the interviewee, James Brown, and you see James Brown, he does the NFL today, he says, the speech belongs to America. The speech belongs to black folks. It does not belong to me. Now, he's been offered as much as $3.5 million for this speech, but turned it down, saying there are more important things in life than money. No, I'm not kidding you. Now, to give you a little bit about him, just so you know, he was an assistant coach at Villanova, went back to his alma mater, then he was an assistant coach at Maryland, and then he became the head coach at Washington State University, which was a little unusual in those days because of his race. Did well there, became the head coach at the University of Iowa, did well there, and became the head coach at USC at the University of Southern California. He got into a really bad car accident in 1994, and it took a long time to recover, and it kind of ended his basketball career. But I'll guarantee you, you will see him as a CBS commentator during March Madness this year. He's there every year. He doesn't do a lot of games, but they have so many games in March Madness that he comes back and helps out. It wouldn't surprise me if you were watching that, or I'll maybe try to watch it, record it. You'll see him commentating on CBS. A wonderful person, and I want you to watch this. I'm going to show it to you right now, and then we'll go to event number 7 in our list. But I want to show you this great interview he had with CBS News. It was in 2013, I think. Yeah, 2013. I won't tell you, but anyway. So we'll watch it. So Rachel, my dear, if you could get the lights, camera, and action on there, we'll get her done. I think now we're still recording, so let's be cognizant of that. So I can get this on there, and I think that it won't be a problem. This is on the course website if you ever want to watch it again or show it to your parents if it gets into anything like that. But I'd like you to see it. It's very, very good.
I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial 50 years ago tomorrow. It's one of the most famous speeches in American history, but there are a few things most Americans don't know about it. For instance, the most famous part of it was not in the original text. It was all ad-libbed. And then there's the question of what became of the text. James Brown has the answer to that.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
It took place right here in this designated spot. As I look back now, I can feel a little nervousness inside my body, a little tremor, because I certainly do it a lot differently than I did then.
50 years ago, George Raveling was a 26-year-old former college basketball star who was a last-minute volunteer, had a coveted spot near the podium during Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s historic speech. But George Raveling's story really begins with what happened after the speech.
Thank God Almighty!
Did you see the button on Martin Luther King's lapel? Anybody see that?
Thank God Almighty!
So with the place going berserk, what did you do when he finished?
Well, people started to stand, and I walked over, and he was just folding the paper, and I said, Dr. King, can I have that copy of the speech?
Did he hesitate?
And he turned and handed it to me. Just as he did, a rabbi on the other side came up to congratulate him, and it was over.
The words Dr. King spoke that day are legendary. But as for the 3 pages they were written on, Raveling simply tucked them away in an autobiography of Harry Truman and forgot about it. Raveling embarked on a successful career as a college basketball coach.
For over 20 years, I never looked at the speech again.
Then one day in 1984, a local newspaper reporter interviewed Raveling about the significance of being the first African-American coach at Iowa.
He said to me, were you ever involved in the civil rights movement? And I said, what kind? And he said, well, what do you mean? And so I told him the story, and he said, you have the speech?
They found the speech right where he left it, tucked in the Truman Book. The typed document has been framed and in a bank vault for the last 30 years.
It doesn't have a title. It's not identified as I Have a Dream. You can simply see the date. You'll see that he pretty much followed the script.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today.
Now notice there's an asterisk here on the copy of the speech.
Right, and this is where we now go into the ad-lib part of the I Have a Dream speech.
Because I have a dream.
It's true. Those famous words were ad-libbed, turning a planned 4-minute speech into a 16-minute historic address.
I have a dream today.
At age 76, Raveling considers himself the guardian of the speech.
The speech belongs to America. The speech belongs to black folks. It doesn't belong to me.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
Scott, Coach Raveling says that he will never sell the speech. As a matter of fact, in his own words, he says some things just don't equate to money. And you know, he's been tested in that regard, having been offered some $3.5 million for the speech a few years ago. He promptly declined.
You know, JB, I wonder, did he say what it was that prompted him to ask for the speech to begin with?
He was quite candid, saying that he wishes he had a better response other than it was just impulse. But given that he was a great basketball player and coach, he showed great court awareness.
JB, thanks very much.
Isn't that a great story? I mean, that is a really great story. This really, I don't know, it's just kind of one of those things in history that is so cool. A couple things I want to ask you about. You know where I told you that President Kennedy, if he would have lived, probably the two things that would have been thrilling to him to see would have been man landing on the moon and the Berlin Wall coming down? If you are Martin Luther King Jr., what thing happens in history after your death that thrills you the most? Come on. That's right. Barack Obama being elected President of the United States. I can tell you right now, Martin Luther King would have never, ever dreamed that in his lifetime, that would have happened. You know what I'm saying? I just think that when Barack Obama was elected, and I remember they had him up there and they proclaimed him the winner, I'm not kidding you, I sat back at home thinking, geez, I wonder what Martin Luther King Jr. would be thinking about this. I mean, it was, black people wept in the streets. It was incredible. Another thing I wanted to mention about the speech a little bit is, when we watch it tomorrow, when can you tell if maybe he's not, when he's starting his ad lib? What would be some hints? Stops looking at his paper, and he just comes up with things, and he's thinking, and he pauses, and the stuff that he says on the ad libism is just amazing that you could give that kind of a speech off the top of your head. Now, I'm just rambling here, but Martin Luther King, when he was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was campaigning in Indianapolis, and he stood in front of a large crowd and gave a speech ad-libbed about it that was incredible. Didn't have a note on it, and we'll get a chance to get into that. But it's amazing what these guys that are good speakers can do under circumstances. Another thing I wanted to finish with that'll take us into the next semester is